Stanislav Vitek, a middle-aged man who was quoted this evening as saying that he had work to go to. I think he's an electrician. He had work to go to in Belgium, but he decided that he just was going to put down everything and travel to Rome. He said he couldn't explain it. He had never met the Pope, but he had a feeling that he should come to Rome right now to give his thanks to this man and pay his own respects. And perhaps that simple message, that personal feeling from one individual from the Pope's homeland sums up so much of the feeling around the world that he was a man who had touched so many individuals. He had struck the note about the human spirit, the importance of the individual against globalization, the worldly forces, that it has hit home with so many individuals around the world. So just whilst we watch these the service going on here in the Vatican City, let's just bring in my colleague Colin Brazier, who's just been out and about in the streets, and just give us a sense of the mood tonight once the news had finally been made public.
I was just thinking again, Jeremy, about the moment actually at St. Peter's Square when the announcement was made to the masses, to the great throng of people there, and it was actually made in Italian. It was the word "mort" that I recognised and made my ears prick up, but I didn't immediately recognise that it was the announcement of the death of Pope John Paul II, mainly because there was no instant reaction. There was applause shortly thereafter, but there wasn't this great groan or moaning. You know, it was not the reaction you might have expected, and I think that says a great deal about what the mass of people there were thinking about John Paul II. They didn't see his passing, they didn't see the announcement of his death either as a shock or as the cause of grief in the most direct sense. They saw it as something to celebrate, which is why en masse they began applauding the news, which may seem perverse to many of us, the idea that they would react in that way, but I think it speaks volumes about what they're thinking. I've been saying, and we've been talking about this over the last day or so, that the pain that he has endured on behalf of this church as Holy Father. I saw his last tour to Lourdes, and some of the scenes there were certainly moved many pilgrims, many people who followed him to tears, and certainly it was the case again this evening that the tears that we saw flowing there may, to an extent, have been tears of relief on the parts of many.
The feeling was, and it was expressed by one of the cardinals, I think, yesterday, that the Pope had run the good race. He had lived life to the full. He had done so much and achieved so much in his life that, in a way, people couldn't ask much more of him, and therefore there was perhaps more of a preparedness to let him go now.
I think so, and I think there'll also be great relief that he was the letting go process wasn't more protracted than it already had been. In particular, Jeremy, you know, the rumours that we were getting that began around about this time yesterday that perhaps he was losing consciousness, dipping into a coma. Now, that could have posed potentially intractable problems for the institution of the Vatican. Constitutionally, in terms of canon law, there are no provisions within canon law to deal with that situation. It really would have created an administrative fog at the centre of curial politics that would have been very difficult to resolve. As it is that, the whole question of the Pope falling into a coma, life support machines, should they be switched off, should they not be switched off, has been completely avoided. It's in a sense a clean break, and it's a clean break that the Vatican, I suspect, will be in some respects relieved has happened.
Sad faces though in the square, and nonetheless, I mean, not surprisingly, tears being shed tonight, tears amongst the prayers, and it would be no other way, really, would it? I mean, whatever the relief, there was bound to be mixed with an equal measure of sadness.
Absolutely, and it's interesting as we look at those pictures, Jeremy, that we can see the lights illuminated on the top floor of the Pope's private quarters there, just as they were when John Paul I died in 1978. It's interesting as well that the timings of the announcement of the death were almost identical, just a matter of minutes between the two most recent popes to die within that 24-hour span. at 9:37, 9:41, I think, if memory serves, for the previous popes. Only 4 minutes between them, which is an almost remarkable coincidence. But you're right. I mean, there is a range of emotions there. And people will now begin that process of reflecting on this extraordinary longevity. Third longest serving pope in history after St. Peter and Pius IX, who was for 31 years pope. And in a time when, of course, there's much more changing. He's had to deal and contend with changing geopolitical landscapes, changing technology, changing morality. And what he's sought to do throughout is keep a handle on, the, as he sees it, the eternal verities. Which of course are very controversial.
Thanks, Colin. That's I know, watching all this and listening with interest and following the events in the Vatican City in London, Father Terry Tastad, who's a priest from Hammersmith in London, and also our religious affairs commentator Alastair Bruce. Perhaps, Alastair, you and Terry could just tell us a little bit more about what we're seeing and hearing in St. Peter's Square tonight, and no doubt it'll be a service and a scene and the sort of prayers that we'll see repeated time and time again around the world tonight.
Well, the scripture has always provided the reassurance for those who wish to follow the faith and to find solace there. And as was being explained by Colin Brazier, seeing the lights now pouring out of the private apartments of the Pope, where at this time those who've looked after him for such a long time will be clearing from it his possessions and preparing him for being carried to a place where the small chapel can be prepared and dignity can be provided and prayers can be said. He'll be put into a place which will be duly prepared and will be respected by the Swiss Guard, who will stand watch over him until he's placed into his coffin according to the express wishes that he laid out in his own expression of a constitution at almost the beginning of his time. And it was also interesting to hear what Colin said about the difficulties that the Church has avoided in that the Pope died in such a gentle and peaceful way that he did, because he's absolutely right. There is no constitutional plan in the long run for how to deal with an incapacitated Pope, and that would one day, I expect, when there are the evolutions of medical skill based against the expectations of the Roman Catholic Church, and maybe the new Pope will need to address that. But now the Church can do nothing to change its constitution. It is leaderless, and although the Camerlengo will appoint and start with the cardinals to have 3 different cardinals taking it in turns to run the affairs of the Church in this, what they call sede vacante, or the empty seat, the period between one pope and another, there is no way in which any of the constitutions can actually be changed. But Father Terry Tastad, you are from Hammersmith Holy Trinity Church, and you will understand what it is that so many of the faithful will require in terms of leadership from their priests, and you felt that this evening when you left your church.
Certainly, when I left the church to come here, people were already gathering outside the door of the church, and although the church was locked, we had to open it up, and we had a picture of the Pope, and prayers were being said by people organized by themselves, actually, before I left. There was, I think at a time like this, you sense a great unity of the Catholic faithful around the world, saying the same prayers with the same intention, the same feelings both of sadness and of thanksgiving, and even also of hope, because the Church always continues into the future.
What is it, Father Terry, that is the direction and purpose of the liturgy at this time?
I think the rhythmic prayers like the Rosary help to settle heart and mind. When people are upset, they find saying prayers like that help them to focus, it settles them down, it centers them within themselves at the same time as it opens them up to God.
Thank you very much indeed, Terry. So, Jeremy, for you out there, as you hear all the prayers taking place, you will understand exactly how the atmosphere is, because you're in amongst it at this minute.
Alastair, thank you. Yes, indeed, the atmosphere you can feel very vividly tonight. The In a way, the relief and the sadness and a sort of calm, an atmosphere, although there are the sirens of passing ambulances from time to time, but otherwise the streets are fairly sombre but calm tonight as people absorb the news and have lost perhaps for a few minutes in their own thoughts about the passing of the Pope. Italy has just announced that it will be declaring 3 days of mourning for Pope John Paul II. And of course there's the official 9 days of mourning that is declared by the Vatican City, during which time the Pope will be buried in the crypt beneath St. Peter's Basilica. Well, let's bring in the leader of the Liberal Democrat Party, Charles Kennedy, who joins us on the phone now. And of course, Mr. Kennedy, a Roman Catholic yourself, you must be having very strong thoughts tonight about what all this means to you and what this man has meant to you during your lifetime.
Yes, very much indeed, Jeremy, and it's obviously a moment of tremendous sadness. There's no doubt about that. Indeed, my mind goes back to being a young student at the University of Glasgow when, in that unbelievable year, the year as it became known, of 3 popes, with the passing of Pope Paul VI, and then of the 33-day papacy of Pope John Paul I, and then suddenly, of course, after that, the absolute surprise and immense shockwaves around the world for the good of the emergence suddenly of Pope John Paul II. And I went to see him when, along with many, many hundreds of thousands of others, as a young person in Glasgow in those days, when he visited the city and conducted a huge open-air mass, the like of which I think Scotland has never seen before or since. So a remarkable person, an infinitely sad moment, but a hugely significant moment also in reflecting on just what this man and his long papacy meant for the development of Europe and the development of the world in a political sense. It really changed it out of all recognition.
Perhaps more than any other pope, or was it just the period of change that he lived through that he was able to have such an impact on? It has been one of the most remarkable quarter of centuries, hasn't it?
Well, obviously, it is, I think, the third longest papacy in such a long 2,000-year tradition. But of course, it coincided with 2 other things. It coincided, given his country of origin, Poland, with the absolutely fundamental changes, the collapse of the Berlin Wall, the liberation of Central and Eastern Europe from the old Soviet domination, the end of the Cold War with it. And at the same time, it coincided really with the era of mass communication of the type that we've been seeing on Sky News over these past 2 hours or so since the announcement of his passing, that the world is a global village now. And this man, in terms of sheer force of charisma and personality, as well as goodness and holiness, was able to reach out to people in a modern technological age, communication age, in a way in which had never been available to any papacy before, and was able to exploit it, in the best sense of that word, most brilliantly and vibrantly. Now that is what has changed the whole perceptions of the papacy itself, but also of the power of a single religious leader who can communicate so dramatically with so many millions of people, many of whom not of his own faith, not of any faith whatsoever.
How much credit do you give him for being among the first, perhaps, to come to terms with the fact that the old East-West conflict had changed into a new sort of confrontation, the sort of confrontation that has led to the world in which we live now, and the modern tensions between the developed world and the less developed world, the rich globalized nations, the capitalist nations, and those who oppose that, in a way, the rise in religious fundamentalism that has threatened the world in which we live. He seemed to have grasped that perhaps before many others.
I think that is undoubtedly right, and I think that when the historians in decades to come analyse in perspective the period of this papacy and the individual of the pontiff over these 26 years, they will see two things. They will see this extraordinary decision, first of all, to elect the first non-Italian pope for such a long time, and to elect a pope from a country, Poland, not just with clearly such a robust and entrenched Catholic tradition itself, but also the country, after all, which triggered, in many respects, from our British perspective, the root causes of the Second World War and all that happened after that Second World War, with the Iron Curtain descending. Then, of course, as that Cold War came to its end, and as the Soviet Union disintegrated and its satellite-controlled countries with it, what have we now seen? We've now seen a new kind of danger in the world, and one in which this Pope continued to his dying days to warn against, caution against, pray against, which was the danger of fundamentalism in other countries, but also the danger of an isolationist approach, being, for example, so trenchant in his criticism of the Iraq War. And I think that this was somebody who saw the huge seismic changes for his own country and for Europe, but also saw, as well as the hope and the opportunity that created for the world, the new dangers that inevitably have arisen in the world, and the way in which, as a global community, we have to approach them with such sensitivity and care.
Huge shoes to fill, and a huge challenge for the man who would succeed him.
Undoubtedly so, and it seems wrong within these past 2 hours, almost exactly since the time of the late Pope's passing, to speculate as to the future. But I think that there will be a great challenge now for the Catholic Church, and a great expectation, not just amongst Catholics, but amongst people around the world generally, to see what kind of political as well as moral lead such a significant religious figure as the Pope, the incumbent Pope of the day, can give where these issues are concerned for the long-term future of the planet, be it global conflict, be it the fact that so much of the world is still feeling excluded, be it the overwhelming challenge of the environmental agenda, which affects all religions, all races and all countries equally. Now, these are going to be massive considerations that now descend upon the shoulders of those in the College of Cardinals, who will make up the conclave over the next few weeks to decide the succession. And of course that succession, both in internal theological terms as well as external political terms, is going to be of very major significance to the world as a whole, and is going to be acutely observed and analysed and dissected accordingly.
Charles Kennedy, thanks so much for joining us on the line. Charles Kennedy, the leader of the Liberal Democrats. Well, from down here at street level, close to St. Peter's Square in the Vatican City, we take you up to the rooftops overlooking it, and my colleague Martin Stanford.
Jeremy, let's see if we can keep the international dimension to our coverage going, shall we? Let's take you to Jerusalem, where we're going to hear now from Father Shawki Batarian, who is with the Catholic Church in Jerusalem. Father, thank you so much for giving us your time this evening. Your thoughts on the passing of the Pope?
Thank you very much. And for me today, personally, actually, they have the impact. I have lost a father, a spiritual guide, and actually I met the Pope for the first time during his visit to the Holy Land. I was seminarian at that time, and I remember when he looked me in the eyes and he told me to carry on and to continue my vocation. Actually, it's a loss for all Christians and Muslims and Jews in the Holy Land.
Yeah, he was the kind of guy, when he told you to do something, you felt encouraged to do it, didn't you?
Yes, actually, I knew just this Pope since my childhood, and even when I met him, he was sick in these days, 3 years ago. 5 years ago, but he was always encouraging the people, and he was always, living his suffering with faith, and this was really a testimony for us in this land.
Perhaps you, living where you do, know this question better than many, but his ability to reach out to other denominations and other faiths, is acknowledged, but some would say he could have gone, perhaps should have gone further. What's your view on that?
Actually, I think that John Paul II made a lot of efforts on the dimension of the ecumenism and the dialogue with the other churches, and the dialogue with the non-Christians, especially Jews and Muslims, and a lot of documents, a lot of efforts, a lot of dialogue. And even when he came here to the Holy Land, he insisted that to go on with dialogue, and since this time we are following his steps to continue his point of view. But no, I think that he made enough, and he made a lot of efforts to dialogue with the other denominations and with the non-Christians, especially Jews and Muslims.
Father, let's just interrupt our conversation, if I may, just to let you know that we're hearing from elsewhere in Rome that the La Repubblica newspaper here, one of the leading newspapers read by many hundreds of thousands of people throughout Italy, is saying that the funeral will be on Wednesday of this week. That is their particular prediction. We have no confirmation from the Vatican of that. My understanding of the usual procedures, and we are in new territory in many ways because these may well have been specified by Pope John Paul in, as is customary, the instructions he leaves for those who succeed him. But it was usual that the funeral would be held within the 9 days of mourning, and not usually before the 5th day of that. So I suppose Wednesday would perhaps fit in that category. Let's just return to Father Batarian in Jerusalem just for a thought, if we may. In our coverage during the last 48 hours, we've been taken by the number of people who've mentioned this Pope's appeal to young people, particularly how young people were interested in his passing, who seemed to be taking an interest in the example he was setting. Is that something perhaps all clergymen of whatever faith, of whatever denomination could learn in reaching out to the youth of the world?
Actually, from this Pope, we can learn a lot of things. He was a magnificent man, and at the same time, he was very simple. He was very humble. He was a man. He was a man of faith, and he was a man of prayers, a man of courage. And he was really very talented, and he used all his talents, the languages, the literature, the poets, in order to grace God and to give his impact on the humanity. One thing that I would like to focus on, that His Holiness the Pope, he always talked about two things, the dignity of the human being and the justice. And he always showed his love for the human being, regardless his color, his religion, and the most important for him, to respect the dignity of each human being. And this thing really has its impact on us all, and we are trying really to implement all his teachings and all his apostolic letters that he published, especially for this point, the human dignity and the justice.
Father Shawki Batarian joining us live from Jerusalem. We thank you very much indeed for your time, your contribution this evening. Thank you indeed for that. Just a word which is coming through from the Clinton family, both Bill Clinton, President Bill Clinton, former president these days, but still afforded that title, of course, his wife, Senator Hillary Clinton, a combined statement issued on their behalf, speaking powerfully and eloquently, they say, for mercy and reconciliation to people divided by old hatreds and persecuted by abuse of power The Holy Father was a beacon of light, not just for Catholics, but for all people. Well, let me put that sentiment as my opening remarks then to Father Andrew Foley, who's from the Bishops' Conference of England and Wales and joins us on the telephone. Father, thank you for your patience with us, and we welcome your contribution tonight. A beacon of light, says President Clinton in his choice of phrase. Would you concur with that?
I would, certainly. I think the words express very well the ministry of the late Holy Father over these years. As I'm standing here outside Westminster Cathedral on the piazza, I can see through the crowds of people moving in and out of the cathedral the Easter candle that's still lit on the altar because of prayers that are still being said for the repose of the Holy Father. And Pope John Paul II was certainly a beacon of light, directing people to the deeper meaning of what it means to be human, as your Jerusalem speaker mentioned, and certainly was a great champion for the cause of justice and peace, particularly of the poor and all people from conception to death. And he died as he lived, a man who was committed utterly to inviting others into deep relationship with the Lord Jesus Christ.
Now, as the faithful probably prepare to go to church, perhaps many others will want to join them tomorrow. How would you encourage people to do that if they want to, and what would you suggest that they should think about?
Right, thank you for that, because as I left the cathedral main door this evening, a young man called Richard came up to me and said he was of no faith, but he would love to be present for the main service tomorrow in the cathedral at 10:30, which is the celebration of Mass, presided over by Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor. And what struck me about him was that he was so deeply respectful as a non-believer, as a man of no real religion as far as I could see, of what the Holy Father stood for over the years of his pontificate, which I suspect was longer than Richard's life. But still standing Richard as a great example of someone beyond the Christian faith, but really deeply rooted in what it means to be human, in what it meant to follow the example of the late Holy Father. I would say to those who are able to gather for any celebration in their area to not take any fear with them, to go along with courage to any Christian or other celebration to commemorate the Holy Father. And if they're not able to do so at home, to find a few moments of peace and quiet, to be quiet, to reflect on the Holy Father. I think the media, by the way, have done a superb job in covering these last days and hours of the Holy Father's life, in giving people a very good understanding of his ministry, of his service, not just of the Catholic Church and the Christian tradition, but beyond that, into the whole meaning of what it means to be alive in these days. And if you're able to in your own homes, to do that quietly, following often the excellent directions given by the media.
Father, he's going to be a tough act to follow.
He is, and I'm not going to get the job. I don't think anyone, seriously, I don't think anyone can say who will follow such a light, such a beacon of hope, such a direction as to what it means to be human, to be fired up by the gospel of the Lord Jesus. And it's in the hands of God, it's in the drive of the Holy Spirit, as those cardinals gather following the funeral rites and the burial of the Holy Father, that particular decision will be taken. And I have no further comment about that, except to say that we must all pray for them.
Father Foley, thank you very much indeed for your contribution this evening.
My pleasure.
We know that services are still underway in many parts of the world, certainly in many parts of the British Isles. I know at the cathedral in Armagh, for instance, there is to be a rosary service, a brief, not a full mass, but a brief rosary service celebrated at 11 o'clock tonight. And I'm sure other parish churches up and down the British Isles and elsewhere in Europe, elsewhere in the world, as the different time zones come to overlap and come to appreciate the news coming out of Rome tonight, that will be the case. And we've seen over the last 48 hours, in some cases, all-night vigils. They were witnessed in Poland, in Krakow, in late Pope John Paul II's home place, and Anna Botting is there for us.
Martin, yes, thank you very much indeed. The mourning period in Krakow has now begun. The flags are already at past. In 1 hour's time, the Prime Minister, Marek Belka, would announce a period of national mourning. We don't yet know exactly how long that's likely to be. Expected to be 3 days, as has already been announced in Italy. And the Polish President is also expected very soon to go on all the television channels here as well. Let's just update you also about what's happening elsewhere in Poland. In Warsaw, one of our colleagues there has passed over 6 churches. There is no room at any of them. People are outside on the street, kneeling in prayer. You have to bear in mind it's a very cold evening here in Poland. Also in Wadowice, the small village some 35 miles from here, southwest from here, where the Pope was born, they have opened the apartment courtyard where the Pope was born, as I said, to allow local people in, and they have made a cross there with candles. Also, just a little bit about the cathedral behind me, Wawel Cathedral. This is the place where the Archbishop Karol Wojtyła worked for 14 years before becoming Pope. They've rung one of the oldest bells, and one of the largest bells in Poland. It was cast in 1520. It's very, very rare that they ring it, and 12 people pulled that bell for some 30 minutes. Let's cross now live to Armagh. Martin Stamford mentioned that. Liam Cray is there for us. Liam, we saw the Pope deal with many of the troubled times here in Poland. Did he get involved also with what happened there during Northern Ireland's troubles?
Well, he did indeed. When he visited Ireland 25 years ago, that was the height of Northern Ireland's troubles. And unfortunately, it was just about 3 weeks after Lord Mountbatten, the Queen's cousin, was killed in an IRA explosion. And on the same day, 18 soldiers were killed in another IRA bomb. So the Pope's advisors decided that it would be a very bad idea to come north of the border. And this is something that the Pope really wanted to do. He wanted to come to the ancient city of Armagh, a city established by St. Patrick in the 5th century. But he also wanted to come because one of his very good friends, Cardinal Conway from Northern Ireland, is buried here at this cathedral, and he wanted to say a few prayers at his grave. Now, even late last year, plans were well advanced for a visit to Northern Ireland and for a visit to this very cathedral for those very reasons. And those plans are something that will not now ever happen. Now, the bells have been tolling here at the cathedral, inviting people to come to prayer, and people have been coming. Hundreds of people have been coming and going, saying a few prayers, just staying for a few minutes for contemplation, for a short prayer, and then leaving again. And now the driveway is full of cars as people are coming up for a rosary service here, which is about to take part in a few minutes' time. And just a few minutes ago, we had a statement from the Catholic Primate of Ireland saying, mourning the passing of Pope John Paul II, a man who he said had a special affection for Ireland and the people of Ireland, and a man who the people of Ireland held in very high esteem. So we're expecting a large crowd here in the next few minutes for this rosary, which should only last about 20 minutes here. Certainly, although there has been a build-up to Pope John Paul's death here, and people had been expecting it, there's no doubt about that, people I've spoken to coming here tonight are still very much in shock.
Liam Cray in Armagh, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, I'm getting the impression that around the world people have been preparing for the death of Pope John Paul II, but I'm afraid that's not necessarily the case here. They were definitely praying for a miracle here. They were praying for his recovery. There have been vigils taking place for about the last 30 hours on the streets of Krakow, underneath the apartment where he used to come and stay here quite regularly. Candles are still burning there, and earlier this afternoon I saw small children laying their candles, their parents explaining to them what was happening, and a great range of generations there as people literally wept. They were so desperately hoping that Pope John Paul would not die and would be with them for more years, more weeks, even more hours, as long as he didn't suffer. It's been very, very difficult for the people of Poland, some of whom were born only knowing a Polish Pope. He is the man who put Poland on the map. Others of an older generation were so proud of him. To them he brought an end to the communist rule. rule, one of the great oppressors. You heard both Tony Blair and President Bush talking about oppression. President Bush talking about the democratic revolution which Pope John Paul II had brought in place. As far as he was concerned, he lived through the 20th century and saw two of the worst oppressors in action, the Nazi regime followed by Soviet-dominated rule of Poland, and the Polish people believe they saved them from that. Let's get the very latest now and more reaction from the Vatican and Sky's Jeremy Thompson.
Thanks, Anna. Well, the lights on in the apartment where the Pope has lived for the last 26 and a half years, the lights shining out over St. Peter's Square. And it was not long ago that the message came down from there that Pope John Paul II had finally died after several days of declining and deteriorating health. And the prayers have continued, the vigils in the square below, as the whole world prays for the memory of Pope John Paul II. Father Terry Tasnard's been watching all this from our studio in London, and Father Terry, good evening to you again, and perhaps you can tell us a little bit more about the services that we've been hearing, the words that we've been hearing, particularly coming from St. Peter's Square tonight, and their significance.
I've been asked to say a word especially about the Rosary, which is a prayer that unites Catholics all around the world at a time like this. It's a set of beads which people say. They say, Hail Mary, Our Father, and glory be to the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. While they say these prayers, they're also meditating on certain mysteries of the life of Jesus. The purpose and part of St. Rosary is to ask for the prayers of the saints, chiefly above all of the Virgin Mary herself. Catholics think of the saints as like friends of ours who speak for us in heaven. They're close to the eternal light and presence of God, and therefore they're able to speak for us very powerfully. And we call upon the prayers of Mary, especially at a time like this.
Very emotional scenes, Father Terry, from the Vatican City here, and also particularly, I thought, from Krakow, where Anna has been reporting. Very moving pictures tonight.
Yes, I've been moved too as I've been watching them. People obviously have a sense of sorrow at the passing of such a great figure that's meant something in their own lives. I think all of us want to have a sense of faith, a sense of hope, something to believe in. And to many people, both inside and outside the Catholic Church, the Pope symbolized that hope we can have for the future, because he himself, of course, centered on Christ, was someone who believed that there was always more to strive for, more to aim for, helped by the grace of God, the energy that God gives us.
The 9 days of mourning that now lie ahead, how will most Catholics prepare themselves for that and the funeral that will undoubtedly take place in the next few days?
I'm sure our churches will be thronged over the next few days, both at times of Mass and outside times of Mass. There'll be people saying prayers privately and in silence, or they'll be attending Mass. And of course, one of the big changes will be that for many of the churches, the intentions of the Mass will be for the repose of the soul of the Pope.
The apartment lights on in the Vatican tonight, the apartment where Pope John Paul died just a couple of hours ago now. All the lights on that top floor. It had been just the lights of his own apartment. Now it's all lit up, and the floodlights lighting up the square below. Tens of thousands have gathered here to pay their respects and, as you heard from Father Terry, take part in the services that will continue on through the evening. Meanwhile, the condolences, the words of praise coming in from world leaders, from heads of state, from religious leaders around the world. The Queen sent a message from Buckingham Palace expressing her deep sorrow at the passing of the Pope. Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister, said that the world had lost a leader who was revered across the people of all faiths and of none. And from the White House, President Bush spoke of a wise and fearless priest who became a man of one of the great moral leaders of our time. We'll have more from Rome at the top of the hour. It's 11 o'clock in London, midnight here in Rome. The news came through that Pope John Paul II had passed away at 9:37 local time this evening. People still coming up in the street where we are and asking exactly what the time was. It is a moment of history, a moment that people will remember, pray about and think about for many years to come. There have been tears and prayers in the Vatican City and St. Peter's Square as thousands who'd waited so long to hear the news finally heard that the Holy Father had passed away, and we have seen similar scenes in Catholic churches around the world. Well, joining me now here in the streets of Rome, very close to the Vatican City, is Bishop John Flack, who's the Archbishop of Canterbury's representative in Rome. Bishop, very good evening to you. Good
evening,
to see you. Just give us a feeling of what you have sensed tonight, the atmosphere in this city.
The atmosphere is wonderful. It's very prayerful and solemn without being too sad. I think we're all very, very thankful that Pope John's suffering has come to an end, and we want to give thanks for a wonderful man and a remarkable papacy which has affected the lives of so many millions of people in this world.
What do you think will be his great legacy? Where will he be remembered most?
His great legacy, I think, first of all, as someone who got engaged with the world. He was very important in the ending of communism 10 years ago or so, but he also entered the lives of ordinary people. He was a man at ease with everyone, and so was able to touch the hearts, I think particularly of young people who loved him very much.
Everybody seems to speak of this the enormous charisma of a man who sort of bestrode the world, but also this very warm and humorous individual as well.
Yes, that's absolutely true. He was a man of heart as well as head, and I think this came across to everyone, and it's why he was a Christian leader not just for 900 million Roman Catholics, but for many other Christians too. And I think I'd like to bring the sympathy, the greetings, the thanks and the prayers of 70 million Anglicans from across the world whom I represent here in Rome.
The relationship with the Anglican Church, how did it fare, do you think, under the papacy of John Paul II?
I think that we shall need to make judgments of that sort later on, but I think what we want to say now is that we all loved him, and that will be what we shall remember of him, his warm-heartedness and his humanity and his ability to love us all.
Does he leave the world a better place tonight because of his presence?
I think he'll leave the world a better place, not least because he's shown a remarkable example of how to bear suffering and how to come in the end to what Catholics have always called a good death.
And a thought about what lies ahead for the Church. I mean, for a man to have sat at the head of the Catholic Church of 1 billion people for 27 years almost, must leave a huge void, doesn't it, when he passes?
It will leave a huge void, and of course things will be different when he's gone under a new Roman Catholic leader, and we look forward to that. But as we look forward, we look back with enormous thanksgiving for the heart and love of a man who will be long remembered and who has influenced us all.
Bishop John Flack, the Archbishop of Canterbury's representative in Rome, thank you so much for talking to us.
Thank you, John.
I think we'll just leave our viewers with the sounds and the pictures from the Vatican City for a few moments.
Preservaci dal fuoco dell'inferno, porta in cielo tutte le anime, specialmente le più bisognose della tua misericordia. L'eterno riposo dona a lui, o Signore, splenda a lui la luce perpetua e riposi in pace. Amen. O Madre sul Santo Romano Pastore, rivolgi lo sguardo materno d'amor.
Il Signore ha chiamato il suo servo Giovanni Paolo alla Pasqua eterna. Noi vogliamo vegliare mettendoci in ascolto della parola del Signore che nella liturgia della seconda domenica di Pasqua ci viene annunciata, perché è piaciuto al Signore chiamare l'anima del suo servo e nostro Papa Giovanni Paolo proprio nel cuore della seconda domenica di Pasqua, che Giovanni Paolo ha voluto dedicare alla celebrazione della Divina Misericordia. Noi da questa sera siamo introdotti nella liturgia pasquale non della prima domenica dopo Pasqua, ma della seconda domenica di Pasqua, perché è sempre Pasqua. Per 50 giorni la liturgia resta come immobile nella celebrazione dell'unico grande giorno pasquale.
The scene, the words and the pictures from the Vatican City tonight as the Catholic world gathers in prayer for Pope John Paul II, who passed away at 9:37 p.m. Rome time tonight. Our religious affairs commentator Alistair Bruce is watching all this with us, and Alistair, perhaps you'd be kind enough to explain a little bit more about what is being said, the significance of the service at the moment.
Well, as we now move into Sunday over for you in Rome, it is now, of course, Divine Mercy Sunday, and for Roman Catholics ever since the year 2000, when the late John Paul II identified the first Sunday after Easter as Divine Mercy Sunday, it's a chance to think back at the extraordinary revelations that were explained by Saint Maria Faustina, who was a young, uneducated Polish nun who received this extraordinary revelation of messages from Jesus Christ. She had a vision of Christ with two shafts of light appearing from his body, one red of blood and the other much lighter, which was the water that washes away and provides mercy in no limit to those who place their faith in him. And she expressed this, and of course it hugely impressed the young John Paul, as he would become, and he therefore saw to it during his pontificate that he established this special Sunday. And many Roman Catholics felt that perhaps it was the Lord's will that John Paul II would leave this life on Divine Mercy Sunday, which he had established on Easter Sunday in the year 2000. And that's the prayer that they're now marking, and the Sunday that they're now all bearing in mind with the thought of John Paul's death.
Sky reporter Alex Wilkinson in London has been listening and translating some of this. Alex, just give us a feeling of what is being said, the words that are being used for those of us who don't speak Italian.
Well, at the moment they're in the middle of a prayer service, clearly in the memory of Pope John Paul II. 70,000 people, according to Vatican television, gathered in the square now. They also mentioned the many travels that the Pope did during his papacy over the 26 years or so, and according to Vatican television, they were saying that over the next few days they'll be showing the best parts of those trips, the most interesting speeches, the most memorable moments of his journeys, not just around Italy but around the world as well. At the moment, the 70,000 or so pilgrims in the square are being invited to pray for the soul of John Paul II.
Celebrate il Signore perché è buono, perché eterna è la sua misericordia. Dica Israele che il Signore è buono, eterna è la sua misericordia. Abbiamo contemplato, oh Dio, le meraviglie del tuo amore. Lo dica la casa di Aarone, eterna è la sua misericordia. Lo dica chi teme Dio, eterna è la sua misericordia. Abbiamo contemplato, oh Dio, le meraviglie del tuo amore. Mi avevano spinto con forza per farmi cadere, ma il Signore è stato mio aiuto. Mia forza e mio canto è il Signore, Egli è stato la mia salvezza. Abbiamo contemplato, oh Dio, le meraviglie del tuo amore. Grida di giubilo e di vittoria nelle tende dei giusti. La pietra scartata dai costruttori è divenuta testata d'angolo. Abbiamo contemplato, oh Dio, le meraviglie.
Psalm floating out across St. Peter's Square in the Vatican there tonight, just after midnight. It's now Sunday morning on Divine Mercy Sunday, just some 3 hours after the announcement that the Pope had died. Well, let's bring in on the line now Anne Widdecombe, the Conservative MP, who herself is a practicing Catholic. Very good evening to you, Anne
Good
Widdecombe.
evening.
firstly, presumably a personal and a spiritual loss for you.
Yes, indeed. The Pope was very much one of the factors who drew me to the Catholic Church 12 years ago. His holiness and his example and the way that he travelled the world and was taking out the message were all enormous sources of inspiration. But I think, secondly, as a Roman Catholic, just acknowledging that Catholicism is massively stronger and massively better understood as a result of this Pope's reign.
He also was a man who took it and strengthened it in new parts of the world,
Yes.
the developing world.
Very much so. I think he had a real empathy with people who were oppressed in all sorts of circumstances. We need to remember that when he was studying for the priesthood under the Nazis, he was doing so clandestinely in an underground seminary. And the result of that was that he was taking jobs in very menial labour to keep himself going while he did that. So he had, from his very early years, sympathy with people who were oppressed politically by harsh regimes, but also who were in poverty, who were actually physically suffering. And I think that was the empathy that he took out to the world, and that was what generated the enormous response. My abiding memory of this Pope will be him up on his Pope-mobile, waving to the crowds who were responding as no crowd ever yet responded to a pop star.
No doubt, I mean, even as a politician, you'd admit that a man like this, a religious leader, can get to the parts that politicians often can't reach.
Oh yes, and I don't think there's any doubt at all that his was a tremendous influence in the ultimate overthrow of communism. Not acting as a politician, but acting as somebody who had known the oppression that Poland suffered.
How much of an impact, though, did he make on the politics of the world in which he lived over the last 26 years?
I think he made a very large impact. As I say, I think he had a direct responsibility. He wasn't the only one, but he had a direct and very major responsibility for the fall of communism. I think he did preach a message of peace. He did give world leaders pause for thought. But above all, he just appealed to so many people, and it's those people who will be mourning him tonight.
He took very strong stands on many issues, which of course were moral, ethical issues, but also issues on in areas that politicians also have to make decisions about, to legislate about. Were there conflicts there at times, do you think?
I don't think there were conflicts, but I think one of his great strengths as Pope was he never compromised on the doctrine of the Church, never compromised on the teachings of the Church, even when those teachings were very unpopular, those that did cover moral issues, for example, such as abortion and AIDS. And he never wavered, and he has left the Church stronger, A, because he didn't waver, but B, because despite that, he still took the message out to ordinary people everywhere.
Many suggest, as you were hinting at yourself there, that he was steadfast in trying to lead a path through a world of which he saw great moral confusion.
Yes.
Confusion often which the political world does not always put right or help people to lead through.
Or even necessarily want to put right. I think that politicians are much more likely to blow about in the wind of favour and popularity than is the leader of a major church. But I think that this Pope summed up his own views best in that encyclical of his called Veritatis Splendor, that is to say, the shining of truth, when he simply said, you cannot determine what is right by what is popular. Something can be very popular, very widely accepted, and still be profoundly wrong, and that it's the Church's duty to teach what is right.
He certainly took a strong stand on the issue of the Iraq War, which he was against.
Yes.
and yet the majority of politicians in the British Parliament had backed that war. Again, a conflict of interest. How do you balance that out as a politician and as a Catholic Church follower?
I would be very surprised if the Church didn't always preach in favour of peace. But that is not to say that the Church believes that all wars are unjust. The Church does acknowledge a concept of a just war. The politicians have to try and make the decision as to when that war is just, but it would be a very odd Pope who didn't preach the supremacy of peace.
He seemed to be a man, though, that perhaps recognised before many others the dangers of the new conflict that has developed in the world between the rich and the poor, between perhaps the Western Hemisphere and the less developed world, that has led to the fundamentalism within religion that has caused so much friction in our world today.
Yes, I think he did recognise that quite early, and he did recognise the dangers. I think probably did a lot more than many world leaders have done to try and focus attention on the developing threat.
So will you remember him as a great Pope?
I'll remember him personally because I once met him, and the thing that struck me on that meeting was the immense holiness which just emanated from him to such an extent that in his presence I actually felt I was closer to God just for being in his presence. But also on a much wider basis, I will remember him, as I say, on that Pope-mobile, just appealing to ordinary people to whom he always thought his mission was first and foremost.
Anne Widdecombe, thank you so much for talking to us tonight. Anne Widdecombe, the Conservative MP, on the line. Well, as you see these pictures from Krakow tonight in Poland, very close to the Pope's birthplace 84 years ago, the candle burns on for him in his memory there and around the world tonight. Well, let's take you across Rome to the other side of the Vatican City, high on the rooftop, my colleague Martin Stanford. Martin.
Jeremy, thank you once again, and we're here adjacent to St. Peter's Square, which is still, if not full, certainly has many hundreds, if not thousands of people coming now to take part in the celebration of Pope John Paul II's life. Let me bring in our colleague Alistair Bruce, who's been guiding us through some of the ceremonial that's been considered in the moments leading up to Pope John Paul's death and now is actually being enacted and of course will have to be obeyed. I'll bring in some of the words and some of the thoughts of our viewers in a moment, because we want to thank you very much for sharing some of your memories of Pope John Paul II with us by email. But Alistair, just first and foremost on this issue, which I think we still haven't got official confirmation, but that the funeral may be held on Wednesday is being suggested by the normally reliable and very well-read newspaper La Repubblica here. Now, I think earlier in my remarks I may have got my maths wrong. That would be consistent, wouldn't it, between the suggestion from the Pope that the funeral should be held within 4 and 6 days after his death?
Martin, you're absolutely right. The day that the Pope died, of course, for you is yesterday, and for we in Britain it's still today. But we're therefore moving into the second day of the Novem Dialis, the 9 days of official mourning. And on between the 4th and the 6th date, according to the constitution written to define this, which is called Universi Dominici Gregis, which was drafted by Pope John Paul II at the very earliest part of his pontificate, laying out exactly how the structure of ceremonial should take place. And what we know is that it's very likely to be on either, therefore, Wednesday, Thursday or Friday. And if the rumour is that it's Wednesday, that wouldn't necessarily be that surprising. In the past, it used to be much later in the 9 days because it took so long for the cardinals to be communicated with and brought back to Rome. Of course, in the past, Rome was really where most of the cardinals were, and the far extension of the Catholic Church was really not as great as it is now. It now stretches all over a much wider and much more inclusive world. But they will all come in, and they will take part, because they are, of course, the priests in the different churches of Rome. Our own cardinal in England, for instance, has his own church out in Rome that he is the nominal priest at. And he will go out there, as with all the other cardinals, who will then give sermons to reflect upon the considerable gifts that John Paul II has given to the church. And that will prepare all for the funeral. And then there'll be more days of mourning while further sermons are given by cardinals and others throughout the Roman Catholic Church. And we'll start to get a sense of where maybe people hope that the church will move in carrying on the baton that has now been laid at rest by Pope John Paul II.
Alistair, thanks for those thoughts and that guidance. Some emails coming through to us then as we watch these pictures from the square just away behind from where I'm broadcasting this evening. One coming in from a relative of the late Pope, that's Jason Watila, who writes to us from Bristol. The world has lost a great saint, he says. He now joins my granddad, his cousin. May they both rest in peace. And then Pauline Green wrote to us a little while ago, for Catholics it was expected and was the right time for this remarkable leader to go, but just as if each of us should lose our own father, it was so appreciated that when we were able to be in Rome and as near to him as was possible. And a thought from Andrew Calvert writing to us. He liberated Poland, he says. He himself is now liberated. God bless all Catholics. And from the non-believers, an email from Nat Lockwood in Bradford. Although not a Catholic myself, I was saddened to hear of the loss of the Pope. He's no longer suffering and in a better place and is watching over us all to help keep us safe. A final thought at this stage from Peter Carter. The world is saddened at the loss of a profound man, but we rejoice in the news that he has at last reached out and touched his Lord. The end of a long road. He never faltered or swayed from his heavy duties. We've been bringing you pictures from both here in Rome and perhaps fittingly on this evening as we move into the Divine Mercy Sunday, also from Poland, Pope John Paul II's homeland. Let's return there again and rejoin my colleague Anna Botting. Anna?
Yes, Martin, thank you very much indeed. There is some absolutely haunting music coming across the rooftops here at the moment outside the Franciscan Church, very near the apartment where Pope John Paul II would regularly stay on his numerous visits back here to his homeland. As I look across the rooftops as well, you can see candles flickering now in many of the windows as the people of Poland try to say goodbye. It's been a very difficult time for them. There's been a sense of shock and heartache here. And I can also say now that the Polish government has just announced there will be a period of national mourning. It will run right up until the funeral of Pope John Paul II. Now with that, back to Jeremy at the Vatican.
Thanks, Anna. Well, the very latest here from one of the influential local newspapers here is that the funeral may happen on Wednesday. It certainly happens between the 4th and the 6th day of the Novem Diales, the 9 days of mourning that are stated under the apostolic constitution here that the Vatican has now put into practice. So the funeral will probably take place Wednesday, Thursday or Friday this week. La Repubblica newspaper suggesting that it will take place on Wednesday. The Italian government has already announced tonight that there will be 3 days of national mourning as tributes come in from world leaders and from heads of state and religious leaders from around the world. The Queen from Buckingham Palace expressed her deep sorrow at the passing of the Pope. Tony Blair said that the world had lost a leader who was revered across people of all faiths and of none. Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the UN, talked about the Pope as a tireless advocate of peace. Jacques Chirac, the President of France, said his nation was deeply moved. All of France is in mourning tonight. And President George Bush talked of the Pope as a wise and fearless priest who became one of the moral leaders, a hero of our age. We have lost a champion of freedom. That's some of the words that I thought expressed the last few days better than most was one of the cardinals here who had had an audience with the Pope in the last 24 hours and had been taken into his apartment and had been to the bedside of the Pope, and he spoke about the Pope lying on a huge bed with white blankets and sheets. Everything was white. And he opened his eyes and the Pope smiled at me, he said. It was a sweet smile that I shall never forget. Those eyes followed me as I left. Well, tonight the eyes of Pope John Paul II are finally shut after 84 years on earth, over 26 years as the Holy Father, here based in the Vatican City. My colleague Alex Rossi now looks back at the life of Pope John Paul II.
An image of what a pope should be, but it's an image created by John Paul II. Before him, pontiffs were largely remote, aloof figures confined within the walls of the Vatican. But John Paul II was a new pope for a new age. He became one of the most famous faces in the world, using his celebrity to further his mission as he visited more than 100 countries, circling the globe over 30 times. The desire to expand and protect the Catholic Church had its roots in hardship. Karol Wojtyła was born in the small town of Wadowice near Krakow. He spent his childhood in this house, now a museum. They were difficult years. His mother died when he was just 9. His brother 3 years later. In 1939, when he was in his late teens, his native Poland was invaded by the Germans. He'd already chosen to go into the church, but under the Nazi occupation had to conduct his studies in secret at an underground seminary. After the war, Poland became a communist country, and the young priest struggled to maintain his religion in an officially atheist state. Showing the determination that was to become his hallmark, he rose swiftly through the Catholic hierarchy. Nevertheless, his election to the papacy in 1978 was unexpected for a number of reasons. He was the first pontiff from behind the Iron Curtain, an appointment which sent shockwaves through the Soviet Empire. He was also the first non-Italian pope in over 400 years, and at 58, the youngest in a century. His relative youth and active lifestyle earned him the nickname God's Athlete. In the coming years, he was to draw heavily on these physical reserves. John Paul's papacy was almost ended in 1981 when a would-be assassin shot him in St. Peter's Square. An amateur cameraman captured the moment 4 bullets struck the pontiff. So grave were his injuries, he received the last rites. His recovery was viewed by many as miraculous. John Paul put it down to divine intervention, claiming the hand of Our Lady guided the bullets away from his vital organs. He later went to prison to offer forgiveness to the man who'd tried to kill him. The Pope never regained his former physical strength, but resumed his work with undiminished determination. Never fearing controversy, he gave his full support to the fledgling Solidarity movement in his native Poland. When he returned home in 1991 after the fall of communism, it was to a hero's welcome. The Pope's commitment to peace was long-standing. On a trip to Ireland early in his papacy, and well before the peace process had got underway, he issued this appeal.
On my knees, I beg you to turn away from the path of violence and to return to the ways of peace.
When he visited the UK in 1982, he was the first Pope to set foot on British soil for 450 years, heralding a new era of interdenominational cooperation. South Africa was another country on the papal itinerary, but on his insistence only after the apartheid regime had been removed.
To say the visit is long overdue is to pay tribute to your own abhorrence of the system of apartheid.
More recently, he was at the forefront of opposition to the war against Iraq, telling both Tony Blair and President Bush it was a failure of humanity. But many who admired the Pope's commitment to political freedom were less impressed by his unyielding stance on matters of doctrine. His views on the ordination of women, abortion, contraception and homosexuality were unapologetically conservative. Many liberal Catholics regarded his reaction to the paedophile scandal which rocked the church in America as too little, too late. As he wrestled with the problems of making the church relevant in the new millennium, John Paul II embarked on a symbolic pilgrimage to the Holy Land. On the 2000th anniversary of the birth of Christ, he visited the Church of Nativity, where tradition says Jesus was born. Shutting out the unceasing demands imposed on him by his office, John Paul II prayed alone. But the trip was not purely spiritual. Here too was a political dimension. He visited Yad Vashem, the memorial in Israel to the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis, an act of contrition on behalf of the Vatican, which had, during the war, remained silent about the Holocaust. He also used the pilgrimage to build bridges with Muslim leaders, part of the Pope's long-standing efforts to foster greater understanding between religions. The first undeniable sign of the Pope's failing strength came in Slovakia, when he was unable to finish a mass in front of 200,000 believers. Vatican officials abandoned attempts to deny that Parkinson's disease was diminishing the Pope's powers. On his final visit to Poland, his frailty told the adoring crowds they'd not see him again. He'd come home to say goodbye. In October 2003, John Paul II celebrated the 25th anniversary of his papacy. Surrounded by the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, he achieved a long-held ambition, setting Mother Teresa on the path to sainthood. He installed 30 new cardinals, adding to the ranks of those who choose his successor and preserve his legacy. As his own health continued to fail, he joined pilgrims at the Shrine of Lourdes. He told those seeking relief from their ailments that he shared in their physical suffering, but described it as a burden that was part of God's wondrous plan. But it was a burden that finally proved too heavy to bear. Complications after a bout of flu depleted what was left of his once legendary strength, and a tracheotomy robbed him of the power of speech. As he looked down on the crowds gathered in St. Peter's Square on Easter Sunday, unable to address them for the first time in his long papacy, it was painfully clear that John Paul II's era was drawing to a close. On becoming Pope in 1978, John Paul had chosen as his personal motto the Latin words, totus tuus. They mean all yours. A fitting epitaph for a historic papacy and a remarkable man.
And here in Rome, let's bring you the very latest information which the Vatican has just released to us. And that is that the Pope will be lying in St. Peter's Basilica no earlier than Monday, they say. Arrangements still to be finalised. They've also let it be known that the Pope's final hours were conducted in continual prayer, their phrase, and that the cardinals will meet on Monday at 10 a.m. So that is when they will have their meeting. That wouldn't, in my understanding, be the beginning of the conclave itself, but the cardinals will be meeting at Monday. They will then have to understand, perhaps have explained to them the exact arrangements that Pope John Paul has communicated to others that he wishes to be carried out, the arrangements. The body is going to be brought into St. Peter's on Monday afternoon. We are hearing now, as we watch some of these pictures of those who've come down to St. Peter's, the Vatican television service offering these to broadcasters around the world. And the tolling of the bell still heard right across Rome on a fairly still and becoming chilly night now, already Sunday morning here. Just the final few minutes of Saturday back in the UK. So, as the announcements are made and the cheering is heard amidst the prayer, and as we witnessed this afternoon, that as some of the statements come out from the microphones that carry the messages to the people in the square, some of these messages greeted by applause, such is the feeling of people here that this great man, who they all revered, have made his way into the afterlife in showing the whole world such an example by so doing. Now, let's just bring in Alistair Bruce, who is with us in the studio. We get a sense there of the applause, the clapping from St. Peter's Square. Alistair, your thoughts as we watch together these pictures?
Well, look at that Polish flag flying there bravely amongst the crowd that have gathered in the Vatican. It is a deeply moving event, and we're hearing the spontaneous applause, which is very much the Italian way of expressing their emotions at a particularly moving moment. And behind the great statue of St. Paul, rising up behind and leaning as it does towards the Pontifical Palace. You were talking earlier on about the fact that the first of the meetings of the cardinals will take place on Monday. That will be the first sort of administrative meeting because, of course, the cardinals are now in charge of the church until the conclave begins. The conclave, which is the process of election of a new pope, will not start until after the 9 days, the Novem Diales of mourning, but it must start before 15 days from the date of the Pope's death yesterday. Or yesterday in
Alistair,
Rome's
let's
terms.
pause a minute. It's almost as if there's a football-like chant starting up around St. Peter's. Let's listen in.
Ora vogliamo riascoltare il primo messaggio di Giovanni Paolo, il messaggio con cui ha inaugurato il suo servizio come nostro Papa. Il
Alistair, we're talking about
che ci
the
ha
arrangements
ripetuto
and the running of the Catholic Church, and certainly the handling of this sensitive matter of the funeral arrangements. Now, one of the news agencies here in Vatican City has reported that the funeral of the Pope is not before Thursday. We are, let me underline the fact, we are in the realms of conjecture here. We've got conflicting reports. One from the major newspaper here, one of the major newspapers, La Repubblica, who have suggested that the funeral date will be Wednesday. Another organisation, a news organisation here, not the Vatican itself, incidentally, is suggesting that the funeral of the Pope will not be held before Thursday. Remind us again, Alistair, as we understand the instructions, and subject to any unusual changes, it would be Wednesday, Thursday or Friday that would be the likely candidates.
That's correct, Martin. Wednesday, Thursday or Friday, the 4th to the 6th day of the Novem Diales. What I think will happen now in the preparation for that, the Pope's body will be placed into the coffin or perhaps taken down anyway to lie in state in the Sala Clementina, which is in the floor below where the Pope died 3 hours or so ago. And there he will be placed while waiting before he's taken into St. Peter's, the Basilica, in his coffin, which is a 3-skinned coffin, the outer being of a very simple wood of cypress. Just inside that there'll be a lead coffin, and right on the inside a very plain wooden coffin in which he will be placed in his full pontifical robes. And that will give the chance for all those who come in pilgrimage to St. Peter's from Monday until the date of his funeral to file past and to offer their respects. And in the meantime, the Catholic Church will be cautiously handled under the guidance of the Cardinal Camerlengo, who is like the Chamberlain of the household. And every 3 days, another 3 other cardinals will be elected to just keep an eye over the different responsibilities to keep the church's work going.
del Padre nostro che ora vogliamo cantare insieme.
And once the Pope's body, Alistair, is placed in St. Peter's, one would imagine the number of people who might want to pay their last respects to that most remarkable of pontiffs. Well, we can only guess at the numbers, but one would imagine they're going to be sizable.
Well, we remember that not all that long ago in London there was a funeral for Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, on an enormous scale that nobody quite comprehended. But when you think that this is an international figure, a man who has led 1.1 billion Catholics and has influenced the entire world, no matter what their faith, no matter how they are driven in their thought, he has been an influence and has, in his own way, expressed a very significant impact upon the world. And that is the Christ figure directly above the main door of the St. Peter's Basilica, and that Christ figure below which the Pope actually took on the responsibility of being Pope back in 1978 when he first appeared on the balcony above the very door inside which very shortly his body will be laid for all those who wish to come and pay their respects.
Del nostro fratello e padre Giovanni Paolo II, con la sicura speranza che risorgerà nell'ultimo giorno insieme a tutti i morti in Cristo. Ti rendiamo grazie, o Signore,
Alistair, if
per
we can just
tutti i benefici
overlap
che gli hai dato
your
in
dual
questa
role and your
vita.
dual set of expertise
Come
with
segno
royal
della
matters.
tua
A number of
bontà
people have been emailing
della
studios
comunione dei
asking
santi in
the question about who Britain might send to Rome to take part or be part of any funeral service. A member of the royal family might normally be expected to go, but there's another event, of course, already in the diary for this week. Will that provide some difficulties, do you think?
I think the most important thing will be that there is adequate representation, and there are members of the royal family who are Roman Catholics. And I'm sure that consideration will have been given to this, and advice will be taken from the Foreign Office on exactly who it would be most appropriate to send. And no matter who is selected, I'm sure that were the funeral to take place on a day that is also planned for a wedding, then the most senior and most easily missed, as it were, member of that family would go. But there will also be representatives from government, and in particular from Britain, two others will go. There will be all the cardinals who are in the United Kingdom and over in Ireland will be heading to Rome, but also from England, the Duke of Norfolk, who is the senior Roman Catholic in Britain. He will attend, as it has always been the custom that the Duke of Norfolk will always represent British people and particularly English people out in Rome for such events.
Alistair, thanks for those thoughts and your guidance on that matter. Let's just bring in the Archbishop of Birmingham, that's Vincent Nichols, who's joining us by telephone very late on Saturday evening, early Sunday morning here in Rome. Archbishop, thank you so much for joining us. Your thoughts as we reflect on the news of Pope John Paul's passing?
Well, I think I feel just the same as the people behind you in St. Peter's Square. I've just come out of the cathedral here in the middle of Birmingham, and people have been coming in steadily. No announcement, no invitation, just the instinctive thing to do is to gather and to pray for the repose of the soul of this great Pope who has now completed his work among us, and to encourage one another. We have to encourage each other. We have to remember his most popular phrase, his most commonly used phrase, do not be afraid. So we've sought together the strength of faith, and we've asked for God's mercy for him.
And the news which the Vatican told us just a short time ago, that the Pope spent his final hours in continual prayer, something you wouldn't be surprised to hear, no doubt.
No, that's true. I mean, I think like many people, but exceptionally in his case, he has died as he lived. And he lived with a mind that was always half kind of beyond this world. He was intensely interested and committed to the human story and to the history of the world in which he lived. But he also always had this contemplative heart. I think it's true that as a young priest he used to spend whole nights in prayer, and there was a deep contemplative heart in him. And I guess that in these last few days his sight has already gone beyond this world to his master who he would meet, and I'm sure he's died a good and a holy death as he lived a good and a holy life.
Archbishop, I'm just getting some more details actually, which the Vatican City Press Service is just releasing. He died after an 8 p.m. that's Roman time, so it would be 7 o'clock in London.
Oh, fine.
But a mass taking place then, celebrated by his aides at his bedside. And just to check the last bit of information here, during which he was given the last rites. The Vatican spokesman, that's Joaquim Navarro Valls, releasing this information moment by moment. So once again, even though literally in the last hour of his life, he was a participant in even the modest ways that were still afforded him in a Mass.
Well, you know, it is a custom among Catholics to pray for a happy death, and that news will be of great consolation to Catholics in every part of the world. Because each time we celebrate Mass, each time we receive Holy Communion, we receive a promise of eternal life. And for him to spend his last moments being part of that sacrifice of Christ, and to be there, as it were, receiving that sacramental promise of eternal life, even as he crosses the threshold of death, is a great comfort to everybody. It really is. It really is a lovely thing to know.
We've been reflecting in our coverage today, I hope, some of the amazement perhaps, but also the remarkable nature of this man, that he was able to confront death with such serenity and such contentment that he knew his fate. He didn't seem to be afraid of what was coming next.
Oh, I think that's true. I mean, most of us would be fearful. What it reminds me of, and listeners in England will understand this, is the way that Cardinal Hume approached his death too. I mean, he was a man also who's close to God, and he was able to teach us how to die, not on the magnitude of the scale in which this Pope has done it, but he lived his life on the world stage, and he has died his death on the world stage. And I, for one, will long, long, long remember this night, and all the things that we've learned about him, and what we gather about the strength of faith in God that exists in our human family. Do you know, I think it is right at the heart of the mission of a Pope to call people together, to be a sign of unity. And my goodness, hasn't our human family been deeply united in these last few days around this man? And he's been a great, great blessing for all of us, all people. In this city, I've received messages over the last few days from the Sikh community, from the Hindu community, from the Jewish community. Everybody has been drawn to share these moments of the end of this great man's life.
Have you been surprised by that? That
No.
he has been able to reach out to so many faiths, to those of no faith?
No, I haven't. There's a number of reasons. One is because he had such a deep and passionate love for people. I mean, he was a great, in the best sense of the word, a wonderful humanist. He was a man who believed passionately in the human person. And yet also, and inseparably from that, he was a great man of God. So people who have a faith in God and people who have a real commitment to humanity both found a champion in him. And I think that's partly the great attractiveness of him. He was close to people because he believed in them. He was close to God because he believed in God. And he held those two things together in a way that's pretty rare among us. And that's why we will miss him so much, but we will remember and live off his heritage for a long time.
He had some successes, of course, in bringing about extraordinary change. One thinks of his native Poland, for instance. But there were some tasks which some of his critics might say were left undone. This is still a pretty divided world. We're dealing with a new phenomenon of the dispossessed, the poor, still feeling very much aggrieved compared to the more affluent areas of the world. Do you think that would have been a frustration for him, that he hadn't influenced some other areas of our lives?
I mean, immediately at this moment, three come to mind. One was his deep and permanent horror of violence. And I think he would have been very distressed as he expressed it at some of the recent conflicts that we've seen around the world. I think the second, as you rightly point out, is the scandal of poverty in the world and of hunger. And the third, would have been his deep, deep desire to have gone to Moscow and to have stood side by side with the Orthodox wing of Christianity. I think he always had a deep sense that the Christian faith, especially in Europe, has two lungs, in the East and in the West, and he never achieved, I think, a deep-rooted desire to go to Moscow and to, as he were, bridge that gap between Western Christianity and that heartland of Orthodox Christianity in the Russian Orthodox Church.
Archbishop, we must let you go with just a final thought, perhaps, as you prepare for what may well be a congregation swelled in size tomorrow. What would you say to people considering coming to church in the morning?
Oh, do. Just follow your instinct and come. Whether you're a Catholic or not, there'll be a welcome for you in every Catholic church, wherever you are. And if you find it in your heart that your heart has been touched by this event, then seek out a community in which that feeling will be shared. And join that community for tomorrow and offer your heart to God and offer your sorrow to God. And if it touches things in your own life, follow that instinct and turn in prayer to God, who will no doubt at all welcome you, especially in a community of faith that you'll find in a Catholic church.
The Archbishop of Birmingham, Vincent Nichols, we thank you very much for your time this evening.
Thank you.
As we bring you more pictures from here in Rome, the magnificent building of St. Peter's, the Basilica standing floodlit, proud in the centre of Rome, the entrance, the gateway to the Vatican City, and all that means for the many Catholics who have gathered here today. It would seem that some of the ceremonial, some of the act of worship, or one phase of it at any rate, that is taking place there has ended. I can see from our vantage point just here people streaming away from St. Peter's, maybe content that they have taken part in the services that have been going on almost continuously since the announcement of the Pope's death. Let me turn to our colleague Alistair Bruce, who's watching these events with us in London today. Just remind us, Alistair, of the timeline that we would expect to unfold now. We've learnt a little bit more, haven't we, of what we think will happen when?
Yes, we have. We know that the plans are now in hand with the Cardinal Camerlengo, who's the Chamberlain of the late Pope's household, Cardinal Edoardo Somalo. He's responsible now for closing down the papal apartments, for carrying the fisherman's ring that was taken from the Pope's finger after he had been confirmed dead. That will be crushed and broken into pieces at the first meeting of the cardinals on Monday to demonstrate the conclusion of the Pope's absolute reign as monarch and to ensure that no further changes can be made to the Church's rules. Now the Camerlengo is a sort of chief in charge. He guides the Church. He has very limited powers just during the interregnum, or the sede vacante, the period of the empty seat, the empty chair. And it's interesting to reflect on a pope. He was John Paul II, who died only a few hours ago, was the first pope to wear a wristwatch, the first pope to read without glasses in modern times, the first pope to come from a communist country. He was the first pope to ski, to climb mountains and paddle a canoe. And actually he was also, we're told, the first pope who enjoyed eating a good breakfast of bacon and eggs. And we miss him now deeply, this man of character, this man who will now be looked after by those who've loved him, particularly among them Archbishop Piero Marini, who has been the Cardinal's chief advisor on ceremonial in the Vatican and who was always at his side in every ceremony, holding the texts and guiding him through every part of the ceremonial. And he will be guiding the Camerlengo in preparing the exact wishes of the Pope. And soon we will discover more details about not only the funeral, but here we are going to hear some further sounds from the bell playing from the Vatican, and this ringing out to mark all that is important at this extraordinary time while we recall the Pope's life and we try to bear in mind all the contributions he has made to the worship of the Church and the guidance of the Roman Catholic community.
Specialmente le più bisognose della tua misericordia. L'eterno riposo dona a lui, o Signore, splenda a lui la luce perpetua e riposi in pace. Amen. O Padre, sul santo romano pastore, rivolgi lo sguardo materno.
Good morning, you're watching pictures coming live from St. Peter's in Rome. The news is that Pope John Paul II has died. It was some 3 hours ago that the world learned, and worshippers in St. Peter's Piazza in front of the Grand Basilica learned to the fate of their leader.
A las 9:37 en su apartamento privado. A las 8 de esta tarde había iniciado la celebración de la Santa Misa en su habitación, durante la cual se había administrado a Juan Pablo II el Santo Viático, de nuevo la unción de los enfermos. Se han activado todas
We're
las
watching
normas
tape here
previstas por la
of Joachim
Constitución
Navarro Valls,
Apostólica
the Vatican
Universi
press
Dominici
spokesman,
Gregis,
speaking a short time ago.
promulgada
This
por Juan
tape being
Pablo
brought to
II
us
el
now.
22 de
He's
febrero de
explaining some of the points which we've learned
1966.
over the last hour, and they include the arrangements, or the immediate arrangements, for cardinals.
This evening at
Let's hear.
9:37 in his private apartment. At 8 p.m. began the celebration of the Holy Mass, during which Viaticum was administered to the Holy Father, and once again the sacrament of the sick. All the procedures foreseen in the Apostolic Constitution Universi Dominici Gregis, promulgated by John Paul II on February the 22nd, 1996, had been activated. Il Santo Padre Giovanni Paolo II è deceduto questa sera alle 21:37
That's
nel
the
suo
very latest
appartamento
word
privato.
then from the Vatican,
Alle ore
and the
20
arrangements
era
which they have let be
cominciata
known
la
that
celebrazione della
the
Santa
Pope's
Messa,
body will be
nel corso della
lying
quale è stata
in St. Peter's
amministrato
Basilica
al Santo
from
Padre
Monday. The funeral arrangements, as we understand at this stage, have not been confirmed. There are two conflicting reports, not from Vatican sources, but from different media outlets. The major newspaper here in Italy, La Repubblica, is suggesting the funeral may be held on Wednesday. There is a news agency report suggesting the funeral not be held before Thursday, suggesting either Thursday or Friday. If I may, if you're just tuning our way, at midnight, this very early on Sunday morning, Divine Mercy Sunday as it happens to be in the church calendar, bring you some other words from some people who've been speaking, the political and world leaders. From Kofi Annan, these thoughts, the United Nations Secretary General. He said, "I recall very fondly my meetings with him, particularly sitting with him in his private quarters discussing the question of war and peace when we were thinking about what to do in Kosovo. He was extremely concerned about the world we lived in, and like me, he also felt that in war, all are losers." We heard earlier this evening from President George W. Bush. The Catholic Church, he said, has lost its shepherd. The world has lost a champion of human freedom. A good and faithful servant of God has been called home. Pope John Paul II was an inspiration to millions of Americans and to so many more throughout the world. We're grateful to God for sending such a man, a son of Poland, who became the Bishop of Rome and a hero for the ages. The British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, has spoken in a message this evening. The world, he said, has lost a religious leader who was revered across people of all faiths and none. He was an inspiration, a man of extraordinary faith, dignity and courage. And from Buckingham Palace, a statement on behalf of Her Majesty the Queen. Her Majesty remembers the untiring efforts of Pope John Paul II in promoting peace and goodwill throughout the world. From the Irish Prime Minister, Bertie Ahern, I wonder whether all the changes would have happened in Eastern Europe if he'd not been there for the last quarter of a century. I don't think they would have. I think he made a powerful influence on that change. Just some of the words of the many world leaders from the world of politics, from heads of state and heads of countries who have been speaking in the hours since Pope John Paul II left this world, as far as we can understand, in a peaceful, serene manner, surrounded by colleagues, conducting the Mass and in a continual process of prayer, we were told by the Vatican a little earlier today. Let's then look ahead this Sunday morning. Alistair Bruce is our religious affairs commentator who's been watching events unfold with us in Rome from his vantage point of the Sky Centre studios in London. Alistair, just talk us through the next few hours and the next few days. What's going to happen?
Well, churches all over Rome will remain open, I'm sure, all night, and those that want to will probably stay here in the square at the Vatican. And services during Divine Mercy Sunday will proceed. There will, of course, be one change this week, and that is that at 12 o'clock your time, in midday, there will be no Angelus in the way there always was when the Pope came to the window of his study, the windows that we've been looking at while we've been waiting for this moment to come of his death. From that window, no longer the warm, guiding words that he gave on behalf of the Catholic Church and as the Vicar of Christ on earth to the assembled multitude in this square. But otherwise, masses will be heard regularly and throughout the day, and prayers will be offered up. And the welcome that was mentioned earlier on by everybody we have spoken to who've talked of their own churches here in the United Kingdom, to both believers and non-believers alike who wish to mark the passing of this remarkable man who guided the Catholic Church and who influenced the morals of the world during the 26 years of his pontificate.
Alistair, let's remind ourselves, shall we, of the most senior member of the Roman Catholic Church in Great Britain. Cormac Murphy O'Connor spoke to us from the precincts of Westminster Cathedral a little earlier.
E condotti in paradiso con il tuo fedele
Well, he did speak to us and said some very fine words in tribute to Pope John Paul II. We'll bring you perhaps that little video clip a little bit later on. As you can see, the pictures we're providing on screen coming from Rome, where still the candles are burning in St. Peter's Square, and the musical tributes to the life of Pope John Paul II continue here. These services, Alistair, these acts of worship, which have phases to them in the sense of they go through a moment, there's a moment of contemplation, and then perhaps the spiritual leaders come to the microphones again and lead us or lead the congregation that's gathered in St. Peter's in prayer. And well, I guess we'd expect here that this would continue into the night while the faithful are still there.
It's very moving to hear once again the sound of the Song of Mary, the Magnificat, sung in the very moving site of the Vatican, beautifully lit up in order to focus the not only great sadness at the time of the passing of a famous and very special man and great shepherd, but also to celebrate the fact that he now moves into eternity, which to all members of the Christian faith is that point where a soul leaves the body and enters eternal life. In due course, we will have the chance to contemplate on thoughts of our own cardinals, particularly Cardinal Cormac Murphy O'Connor, who was born in Reading in the Diocese of Portsmouth in 1932, and he was given the particular task when he became a cardinal in Rome of being the priest of the titular church of San Maria sopra Minerva, which is very close to the ancient Pantheon in Rome. The Pantheon in Rome, which stands sentinel at the center of this ancient city, which has been the home of so much of the history of the Western world. And yet the one thing that lived, lifted, and has survived from ancient Rome was the most persecuted of those minorities that came here and lived in the Roman Empire, the Christians, and their management of the faith and belief that they hold to survive it and enable it to continue for 2,000 years as the bells ring out from the Vatican, one of the four great basilicas of this city, now standing above that bell, the great triple tiara of the Pope. Now sede vacante, now the Pope is no more, and these people who gathered to reflect on their own memories and to say their rosaries underneath the rooms where the Pope died earlier on in the last hours of yesterday. It is with this great sadness in mind that so many, not only here in Rome, not only keeping vigil overnight to reflect upon his example, his guidance, his steady influence on the Church, that flag waving there, the colours of Poland, draped with a black mourning band, as the friars sing now their memories are passed up to this wonderful statue of Jesus Christ coming to the edge of this huge basilica, the front of the basilica. On his right, St. Andrew, on his left, St. John the Baptist, and all the other of the disciples of Jesus Christ. And it was the responsibility of Pope John Paul, as the 263rd Pope, to carry on the responsibilities of representing Jesus Christ on earth, holding titles such as the Vicar of Christ, but perhaps the one that John Paul II most wanted to embrace in all this splendor, living in this great pontifical palace, surrounded by the ancient glories of the Roman Catholic Church, was that most simple of titles, to be the servant of the servants of God. And in that respect, the humble man who saw his mother die at the age of 5 and who looked to Mary, Mother of Christ, to be his example, and who always dedicated his principal thought to the Mother of the Church, Mary, in the way he directed his thoughts. Once he gave the most moving